Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Tonight joining me is Ben Kinsley, our co-host and co-producer. Ben, how are you?
Thanks, Pat.
And we have a special guest tonight, Dr. Dan Freilich. He's a progressive Democrat running for the U.S. Congress. Dan,
thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Appreciate it.
This is our
Thanks so much
very
for being here.
first political interview this year. We've sent out invitations to the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and we're going to contact the independents. Anybody wants to be on the show, just call us up or email us at voteforvermont@gmail.com, and we'll get you scheduled. And Dr. Dan, I love that when you put that, brought with him Julius Herlinger. I almost got it, Julius. Julius
Herzlinger.
Shoo, sorry about that. Who is the lead of all of the interns that are working with Dan. He's got 12 of them. Several of them are here in the studio with us, so I don't know if we're going to be chatting or back and forth, but Julius is going to represent the interns for Dan.
Thank you for having us.
Julius, thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Of course,
great.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Cool.
No problem.
We'll put you on the spot.
Yeah,
So see
good.
how much you've learned. How long have you been with Dan?
So it's been about almost 2 weeks now. We just
Well,
started.
you're in.
Oh, yeah.
You got it.
You're in the ramp
Committed now.
ramp up
Things
phase.
are moving quickly,
That's
but
great. So Dan, we always ask people to talk a little bit about themselves, and the show is yours. Go ahead.
A little bit of background. I got married 2 years ago to someone I love very much.
Nice.
I have 5 adult children, at least they think they're adults. I moved to Vermont in '92 after my first Navy stint. I've been in the Navy now for 23 years, 15 years active duty, 8 years in the reserves. I'm a doctor. I guess people always ask your specialty.
Yes, sir.
I'm not sure why, but internal medicine and infectious diseases. I'm an associate professor at the Uniformed Services University, which is the military and the PHS's medical school.
Oh, nice.
I've run multi-million-dollar programs for the federal government, and I am really excited to be here and to be running for Congress.
Excellent. Good Navy. That's my dad.
Oh, good.
Go Navy.
Not Army, right?
No, Navy.
Army.
Oh, no.
Good.
Navy and Marines.
Okay.
That's in my family.
Same boat.
Same boat. Cool.
Right.
So, Julius, tell us a little bit about you.
yeah. So my name is Julius Herzlinger. To reiterate, I'm 22 years old. I just recently graduated from the University of Vermont with a major in environmental studies, in addition to 2 minors, but one of them being political science. I knew I wanted to go into politics, and I really, really appreciate and stand with everything that Dan's platform represents. So I was very excited when I got the opportunity to work as his field coordinator.
Great.
And I'm excited to be in the beautiful state of Vermont for another summer.
That's great. Where are you from?
I was born and raised in Southern California in Newport Beach before moving out here for school.
No kidding. You picked
Cool.
Vermont from California?
I sure
we
did.
love you.
We need more like that.
Yes,
right?
we do.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, Ben, go ahead, jump in.
Quite a
Yeah.
trip. So, I mean, obvious question I'm sure most of our viewers want to know is why you are running for Congress, what your platform is, what your vision is. You know, it's a huge commitment. We're sitting here, and it's just the second week in June, and you're going to have be out on the campaign trail basically for the next 6 months. So, what inspired you to do that and to get out and run for Congress?
You know, I got really committed to this, Ben, back in 2010. Many of your viewers know, many don't, that I ran against Pat Leahy actually for the same general reason. It changed in minor ways, but I've been really committed to this concept, 2 concepts. One is equity, and the second one is honorable service, and I think that they are interchanged, and one is dependent on the other. In the military, in the Navy, there are some core values, and one of the core values is honor. And it pertains to military personnel, and all officers in the Navy need to take an oath, and you have to take the Sailor Creed. And I just feel that for whatever reason, we've codified into law that somewhat dishonorable service, and I'm using a dramatic term on purpose, is okay for elected officials, even though we would never permit it of non-elected officials, of military personnel, most other professions, whether they be doctors or lawyers
Maybe
or
we have
pharmacists.
more in common than we think, Dan.
I hope so. How do you like that?
I like that. Sign me up. That's great.
Well, that's great, because I think that's the point. It's just, you know, asking that we step up to the plate and insist on honorable, unconflicted service, putting others ahead of self. I don't think that's a democratic or progressive value. I don't think it's a Republican or a conservative value. In theory, it should be, all Americans should do it. It is true that corporations give more money to Republican candidates, but they give tons of money to Democrat candidates. And Democratic candidates also take union money. I think if we all try to step up and be honest and try to minimize the conflict of interest and be real public servants if we are going to claim to be public servants, it would be kind of amazing on both sides, and we'd be able to make a lot of progress. It would be so much better decision making on both sides.
What a concept.
So are you really focused on overturning Citizens United? Is that kind of the focal point, or is it even broader than that?
You know, it's much broader. I feel that my party that I'm running in, I'm going to be self-critical, and there's nothing wrong with being self-critical of the organization, in fact, that you endorse. So I'll say something very positive about the Democratic Party. Is my position is that the Democratic Party is currently the only political power base in the country that at least tries to advocate for the average American. One can agree or disagree with that, but that's my position. My critique of the party is that it's so hypocritical and corrupt at the same time. And it says all these great things, yet at the same time, it takes all the money. So, for example, espousing campaign finance reform, and to answer your question specifically, Citizens United, Democrats always state that they want Citizens United reversed, and they lament it being agreed, the Supreme Court voting for it in the first place. But it's easy to say that. A, nothing is happening, and B, it doesn't cost them anything to say that. The question is, if one has personal responsibility up front and tries to do the honorable thing and the true public service act in the first place. I kind of say sometimes it's like civil rights in the 60s or LGBT rights maybe 10, 15 years ago. I'm not sure the exact time frame. In the 60s, before the Civil Rights Acts were passed, there were some people, and in particular leaders, who understood that racism and some of our history was not very commendable. And they stepped up and stopped acting racist and treated all races equally. And then the Civil Rights Act happened, and it was required by law. The same thing with LGBT rights, in that I think in the 90s, 2000s, the cultural change led to people treating people with LGBT differentials, what they wanted in their life, equally. And then eventually the Supreme Court made the decision that codified into law. And to finish this point, I think for campaign finance reform, we need a cultural change where our politicians, our elected officials, have personal responsibility and commit to minimizing a conflict of interest. And when there's enough of that for a few years and enough people doing that, I think eventually the Supreme Court will change things and Congress will change things, including Citizens United.
Do you think we have that issue here on the state level in Vermont? I know you're focused that you're running in a federal race, but do you think that translates to Vermont state politics?
And why are you asking that?
Yeah, I do. I am sorry to say it. Sometimes when I give these speeches in parties, I've started to use this term because a Addison County state rep was sitting to on my left, actually, doesn't really matter, when I was giving a speech in Addison County, and afterwards he came to me and said, "Hey Dan, it's really, really important what you're doing in terms of trying to point out this issue, but I want to point out something to you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "You're busting a bubble." And the bubble in Vermont is that we treat each other with respect, which we do. We always see the best in each other, and we expect the best. It's beautiful, so it sort of creates a positive mantra in the first place. The problem is that we take it to an extreme, and if you assume the best in people when they're not necessarily acting the best, then you're actually sweeping under the rug. And my point to answer your question is that I think almost all our statewide candidates and our congressional candidates, not all, but almost all, take a lot of money from various PACs, corporations, unions, organizations, let's just call it special interests. And I don't think it serves Vermont well.
Ben is asking because he was the executive director for Campaign for Vermont, and what they did, that organization got the legislature to pass ethics law, and we were the only state that didn't have ethics.
One of
or
three states.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
an issue I worked on for almost 4 years
Yeah.
in the legislature, and they passed last year. Governor signed it. It's a first step. It's a
Corporate money.
it involves a bunch of different things, but it addresses
Mostly
conflict of
interest.
but it's a first step. It's not perfect, and the oversight is not what it should be.
Yeah.
But it's a step in the right direction, and it's something that personally I've been very invested in.
Yeah.
Good.
Because
I
it's
think
a
that's
small
fantastic.
state
Yeah.
and people wear a lot of hats. If you're involved, you're really involved, and you've got many hats, and sometimes those hats sort of conflict a little, and it's just hard to avoid that in this state.
Well, and with the citizen legislature, you have, you don't have as much corporate money involved, but you got some inherent conflicts just because you have a job
Right.
outside of Montpelier.
Sure.
And, when you're assigned a seat in the legislature and assigned a committee, oftentimes you're putting on a committee that you have some personal knowledge of, right? So if you're a farmer, chances are you're going to end up on the agriculture committee. Well, that has inherent conflicts because you know the subject matter, you also work in the industry, you're going to be working on legislation that affects you.
Yeah.
I think I would take it even further. Sometimes because we're so small, the interpersonal relationships create immense. Nepotism might be dramatic, but it's that general
Yep.
milieu of people knowing each other, and they're good friends, and they work together, and they know other people who know each other, and therefore sometimes end up taking sides for personal reasons rather than objective
I
decisions.
can see that in because most of my friends in the legislature were from another party, and after you'd fight and carry on, you go out to dinner, and we're all friends, and still are friends to
Good.
this day.
It should be that way.
It is.
So you're running as a progressive Democrat, which I understand has a pretty lengthy definition. Can you explain that a little bit to our viewers, what a progressive Democrat is and the platform that you're running on?
It was only lengthy because you guys gave me homework and asked for a definition.
I know, when
Well,
I
I
asked him, I was
apologize.
so surprised when I got the answer back. It went on forever. I was very impressed.
Well, don't be impressed. Infectious disease specialists were known of all the specialties in medicine were the most comprehensive,
Well,
or
you
OCD,
did a good job.
depending on your point
I
of
can
view.
relate to OCD.
Two sides of the
Okay.
same coin, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to answer that question, but Julius, I think it's kind of philosophical. So I'm interested in how you want to answer that question. How do you see being a progressive Democrat? Because that's really, in a sense, the heart of our campaign.
Yeah, of course. So I personally believe progressive Democrat, we share the core ideology of the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, we definitely lean hard to the left on most topics. Representing your campaign in regards to campaign finance, that means we don't want to take special interest money. In regards to taxation, it means we want fair taxation. We really believe that the top 1% should be getting taxed a little bit more. We believe in concepts such as a single-payer healthcare system. And just to reiterate, we believe a lot what the Democratic Party believes in general. So to use energy and environment as an example, we believe in renewable energy and we want to advocate for technology and a green economy, but we feel that we can do much more than the party's already doing. We want to make creative and transformational change that is going to change the party for a better direction.
Good for you.
So do you think that Bernie Sanders fits the definition of a progressive Democrat?
In a lot of aspects, yes. I would say Bernie Sanders fits a progressive Democrat, but at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders still takes special interest money, and that's something that I don't side with. And as a strong progressive Democrat, that would be the one big difference.
I think it was one of the things, just as an observer, and the presidential race last cycle, Bernie was able to raise an incredible amount of money with relatively limited. He
Right.
did take special interest money. I think
Very little.
Very little comparatively, but I think a lot of people that have worked on campaigns or have worked in politics were surprised at the volume of small dollar donations.
Right, the
that he was
$5
able to bring.
donations.
Very few candidates are able to attract that kind of fundraising in the volume that he was able to, and really kind of turned on its head the concept of what a national campaign could look like.
I think Howard Dean had a lot to do with that, didn't he, with using the web and using the internet and really attracting younger people? But maybe not to the extent that Bernie does.
He and Obama, I think, sort of
Yeah,
turned the tide.
Yeah. So could you add to the definition?
Yeah.
It went on for pages, so
It did. You know, I'm going to make it really simple. Actually, I think what Julia said was fantastic in terms of a pragmatic answer, and you made my life really easy. I'm just going to make it less pragmatic and a little bit more philosophical. To me, a progressive theoretically always puts the community and everybody ahead of self. A Democrat might be a little bit more practical, and a progressive Democrat has high aspirations but also has some practicality in terms of executing policy. So a classic establishment Democrat might be willing to make many compromises that progressives may not be willing to. If you're progressive, you make almost none of these kind of compromises because you're pretty direct, if you want to be critical, rigid in terms of your interpretation. I think we are not willing, as progressive Democrats, we're not willing to compromise true core principles. But on the fringes, we're willing to let some little things go for practical reasons in order to pursue the core issues. So the example that you made, I think taking money from special interests is so core as an abhorrent way of representing constituents that we wouldn't compromise that one at all. Other things, maybe yes.
Yeah, I get it. So you have on as a tagline, which we have ours, it's listening beyond the sound bites, which I always explain, if somebody says it's free, you better start asking questions. just to say that. But you say reclaim democratic heart and soul. And we just were wondering what that meant.
Me too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's have a discussion.
So let's wonder together.
Yes. Do you think they've lost something over the years? I personally, if I may, as long as you said it was okay, I don't see a platform in the National Democratic Party. What I see is them so focused on anti-Trump and just doing away with this administration that you don't get anything from them about their platform. I think they've veered somewhere, but off the platform for sure. Have we done that here in Vermont? Or because it's not the same in this legislature as it was when I served. It's not.
So I agree philosophically with your critique. I think I would probably subtract a little bit. I think their platform is very clear if one goes in and looks at the wording.
Written word.
The written word.
I agree with that.
Okay. But the way it's stated and the way it is communicated to the electorate is lost by other issues. So when I say reclaim the Democrat, to me, the democratic soul is akin to the progressive soul that I kind of defined a moment ago when you asked for a definition. And I think it's more of a communal spirit, thinking of others before self. So it ends up translating to all topics. Back to the campaign finance reform, a true Democrat with the heart and soul of a Democrat would never take special interest money. A true Democrat would not accept a multi-payer system for health care, which again, a Republican might disagree, but a Democrat wants universal health care as his or her absolute priority, and therefore would advocate for single payer and Medicare or Medicare for all, whatever you want to call it, avidly. The environment, a true Democrat will almost always side on an environment versus a business side. Now, hopefully, usually there's a compromise that works for both.
There is.
And there should be usually. But at least the default will always be on that side. And again, to finalize some of the core issues that you talked about, a true Democrat will really, really think that wealth inequality, to the extent that we have now, and honestly, by the way, if we were going to talk about one issue of the campaign, it's actually the most important issue to me, because wealth inequality, I think, is not sustainable for a democracy. Some wealth inequality is fine, but when it's so dramatic, anybody who reads history knows that it always leads to revolution eventually. And I'm not saying dramatic revolution. This is not France in the early 1800s, but it's similar to that, or at least it can be. And I really don't want that kind of instability in our country.
I think I wish I could remember the percentage, but Vermont itself is spreading that distance between the 1% and all others, and we were close in percentage for years and years, and now we're slowly seeing that separation.
You know, the question is why this has happened, and I think it's very complicated, but I know there are a few things that people often will throw their hands up about because they're sort of difficult to address. So for example, globalization. Like, I can't really affect globalization that much as either a congressman or a rep, so we'll just lament that topic. Automation, specialization, all of these are topics that economists always refer to as, but the biggest easily rectifiable one is taxes. And Democrats and Republicans, not socialists, not the ultra-right, Democrats and Republicans in the middle, always believed in the 20th century, throughout most of sort of the height of America, that there is some reasonable sharing of the distribution of our wealth. We had marginal tax rates for the income tax under Eisenhower, the Republican, in the 90s. We had marginal tax rates under Nixon in the 70s, again a Republican. So this was not an ultra-left agenda. There was always some wiggle room and compromise, and everybody pulled in different directions. But at the end of the day, the effective tax rate for the ultra-wealthy was just higher than for the middle class and working people, and it's the other way around. It's kind of like what Warren Buffett says, that that his secretary has a higher effective tax rate. It's funny, but it's really not, because it's the source of a lot of misery in our country.
Interesting. Well, I have to, we were talking before about your website, and I have to tell you, it is one of the most detailed and largest in scope I have ever seen. There is nothing you haven't covered in this website, and I would really encourage you to go to Dr. Dan for U.S. Congress.
Dr. Dan for Congress.
Dr. Dan for Congress, and check it out.
Thank you.
It's
nice
really
of you
excellent.
To say.
No, I like people's when they have good websites, and it's articulate, and whether I agree or disagree, but it's there. So it's up to me to decide, right? So could you have a huge summary, a platform. Could you talk a little bit about, in summary, what your platform is built on?
Sure.
Maybe I've covered it already, but
I think actually
Julius can do this.
Well, he did a really good job actually about the four. Do you want to talk about? I mean, because it is a big platform, and I'm going to turn to Julius in a second for the details. But honestly, it's really four focus issues, and I always want to tell potential constituents, 95% of my time, if I can avoid any distractions, will be spent on these four issues. I think it's important that people know what they're getting, sort of what you're paying for, in a sense.
The stump speech.
It's the stump speech, but I'm not going to get distracted by all the other issues. It's four issues, and you should expect, if I'm elected, that my first 2 years, and maybe a little bit more, and not very long, because I very much believe in term limits, will be focused on these four issues.
Yeah, I highlighted them, but I feel like you could definitely go into more depth and explain them.
Yeah, good. Just repeat them for us, so that for
Yeah,
those
of
of us
course.
who are old.
Campaign finance reform,
Right.
fair taxation, universal health care, and advocating for a green revolution.
Excellent.
Cool.
That's
So well, let's take those one at a time. Maybe we can dive into them a little bit. So campaign finance reform, like we talked briefly earlier, Citizens United, but there's more to it than that in terms of the conflict of interest. What would you like to see the federal government do on campaign finance reform?
So rather than relying on minor law changes that will help but will not change the essence of the problem, is we need a movement, which is what I kind of alluded to earlier. And I'm hoping that my getting elected without taking any special interest money, and I'm not the only one, there are others. I mean, Bernie pretty much stopped taking special interest money. The same for Elizabeth Warren. Even establishment Democrats like Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand, O'Rourke, who's running against Cruz in Texas, have stopped taking corporate money. We go much further, because I kind of feel you can't pick and choose what special interest you're going to take money from.
Right.
So I think it's much more strong morally, and therefore you get political power as a consequence if you don't try to splice where you take the money from.
Right. Don't take it from corporations versus any other group.
Right. And I think when you sit with the opponent party, you can negotiate better. In fact, they trust you more. Maybe you'll sit and have the beer that you referred to afterwards together, or a cup of coffee together, because you'll know that whatever the position of the person you're trying to negotiate with in this roundtable, for example, it really comes from their heart. It's not because they took money from blank, blank organization. So to answer your question, it's personal responsibility, trying to start a movement. I feel for Vermont, congressional candidate can win doing it right without taking special interest money, maybe the next congressional candidate will do the same. Maybe U.S. Senate candidate will do the same. Maybe another statewide candidate, governor, lieutenant governor, auditor, will try to do the same. And if we're lucky in New Hampshire and in Connecticut, they'll do the same thing also. And we'll be able to start reclaiming our democracy.
So lead by example.
That's exactly the point. Role modeling is sometimes I use the term.
And Scott Milne tried to do something similar to this with when he ran against Leahy last cycle, where he took very limited contributions except for small dollar donors, and and basically relied on his message. And is that kind of this a similar type of thing? Is trying to engage people and talk more about your message, and not put up a ton of TV ads and stuff like that? Is that
So we're raising money from individual contributions. We've raised in the last few months $50,000 just from individual contributions, and that was just our first fundraiser. We're now starting another fundraiser. I'm sure we'll more than double that. So definitely going to be competitive in this campaign. Right, we're just not focusing all our time on raising money. First of all, I don't like it at all.
No, I don't think anyone
to-
likes raising money.
To be honest, it's like
Yeah.
the worst part of campaigning. But on a more practical level, I just don't want the distraction of the money rather than issues like you're saying.
Right.
So
That's
you're
very
up
cool.
against somebody who has been in Congress since 2007. And we have a habit here of always re-electing the same folks. We never ask them questions, we just re-elect them. So how are you gonna overcome that? I would use it as a flaw of ours, because we never ask hard questions of our incumbents.
It's a flaw because sometimes we coronate almost, which is kind of what you're alluding to.
Right.
I think that the only goal we have in terms of how we hope to win this election is to tell the truth. And if we do that, I think the electorate will understand that. I want to make sure that people who are listening to this are aware. Were you aware that we announced in our campaign very publicly that I would freeze the campaign and back Mr. Welsh if he would do just one thing?
No, I didn't. This is great. What is that?
Stop taking special interest money.
Ah,
I don't think that will
interesting.
guarantee that we'll get good outcome.
Yeah.
But I think it will guarantee that we have the possibility of better outcome. And it will show that at least our congressman has insight into this problem, which is critically catastrophic for our democracy and for effective policy.
Because there was just an article about the congressman and his taking of pharmaceutical monies, wasn't it? Was that, am I remembering
Yes.
that right? Sorry if I'm not.
No,
But,
you
yeah,
got it exactly
yeah.
right. So that was in the Washington Post,
Right.
and then the Vermont media sort of
Right,
dug
picked it up,
deeper,
right.
Vermont Digger, Bennington Banner,
Right.
others. So if we get into that, this is the second most difficult part for the campaign for
Yeah,
me,
right.
is just the concept of trying to tell the truth to power, if you're going to use that
Right,
euphemism.
right,
But not wanting to be negative. But sometimes if you're going to advocate for reform, you have to explain what needs to be reformed.
What you're going to do, right?
Right,
Exactly.
and you kind of need to tell the truth. So Mr. Welsh takes a lot of money from special interests. 71% of his money comes from PAC money. And I say this because the distinction is, if I am elected and now, I will never take money from special interests. And that's a really important point, back to what you were mentioning about Scott Milne running before. There are many candidates who, in the beginning of their political sphere, say they're not going to take special interest money, and as they start coming up in the polls, and you start getting corporations and other PACs calling them more,
Right.
then they sort of change their mind. And this happened actually in 2010 when I was running, so to another candidate on the federal level.
Right.
So it's really important to hear on a political on a public realm like this, that you're committed to this and you're not going to change when it's expedient to do that. So I would never take special interest money. I won't in the future, and there's no taking back on that.
Good.
Didn't Leahy had a similar transformation, I think. If I remember correctly, in his first campaigns, he was running on a platform of no special interest money. And of course, he's kind of changed his position on that over
Because
the
this
years.
is huge. You're going to, all candidates for national office spend a boku bucks. I mean, I don't even know, it must be millions, I would assume, right? Is it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, I ran for the Senate and I spent $30,000 here in Washington County, for heaven's sake. So to do a statewide race here and national race, it's huge money.
So, but as Ben referred to, it is often stated, as Mr. Welsh answered to me, I asked him, by the way, back in 2010, why he doesn't stop taking the money. I was at the Curtis Awards at the Hilton in Burlington. And I might be off by a word, but basically what he said is that you need to do this to win. I think that practicality or that rationalization honestly is insufficient anyhow, because you can say that about anything in your life. I do this because this is what I need to do to be successful, but if it's wrong, you shouldn't do it in the first place. But put that aside, let's say for the sake of argument that it is true. I think as you alluded to, Ben, I mean, Bernie showed that paradigm might be incorrect. And in fact, it might be so safe that it leads to loss because the populace is so fed up and disgusted by that kind of politicking. And as a Democrat, I would posit that Trump's election, you brought up Trump earlier, to a very significant extent is because of the Democratic Party. Back to the question you asked me about the heart, that our heart is just not there. And it looks corrupt, it looks hypocritical, and people say, well, all right, I'll just take my chance on anything different.
But they don't seem to understand that. I'm talking the Democratic Party. I mean, why did Trump win? They go through all this impeach and all this stuff, but why did he win? Take a look at that. What are the people trying to tell you?
Sure.
They're fed up.
I know, I agree. Could you imagine if Hillary, by the way, in the middle of the election, sort of all of a sudden stepped up and stated that she has insight in that the way she's been raising money her whole political career is wrong. Oh. Imagine if she did that in public.
People would pay attention.
They would pay attention, and I'm going to stop doing that. I was wrong, but now I want to change.
Wow.
And people can grow, and that would have been very commendable. And I kind of suspect she would have won had she done that.
Well, maybe so, because people were a little worried about all those things. So.
Sure.
Anyway, wow, this is interesting.
It's interesting. It's very interesting. Yeah. I think it goes back to something you said. Which was credibility, right? You can get around a lot of the candidates spend, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, even just in Vermont, building up their position or tearing down the other guy, right? And but if you came at it, the problem with either of those is it eats away at credibility, right? And either of those scenarios eats away at your own credibility. But if you run from a position of I'm credible and here's what I'm going to do and here's what I'm saying, and I don't need $2 million or $5 million of PAC money behind me to do it.
Yeah, people pay attention.
Yeah,
that's great.
People will pay attention.
Could we skip to the other on page 2, because I would really have the time of. In your website, you have, as I was saying, you have an amazing platform. You've got priority issues, which we've sort of touched on, but you have a list of issues that I'd like to take a few minutes, because these are the absolute issues that we're dealing with right now in Vermont. So I think people would love to hear what you've got to say about these issues. The first one is, and I'll just run down the list, affordable education. What is your feeling about that, other than the fact that it should be affordable and quality? But we're working on it.
It's interesting.
It's only taken us a gazillion years, but we're working on it.
So Vermont made a decision. I mean, it was a concerted, aware decision a long time ago that our education expenditures are going to be prioritized for pre-12.
Right.
And higher education will figure it out. I mean, it's not that black and white, but overly simplistically. I think that's great, but maybe we took it to an extreme. I'm running on a federal level. I truly believe that access to postgraduate education is just mandatory as an option for middle class and working people to succeed. So equal opportunity. Nobody's asking for handouts, but at least equal opportunity. When Bernie said free public education, public school, colleges education, do you know how much that would have cost to make all of America free access to public? Do you remember what the bill would have been? It's actually not that much in the big scheme of things. $45 billion.
Well, given our debt, that's probably a very small percentage, right?
Well, yes. Now, as a Democrat, I believe that the ultra-rich and corporations, which I really hope that we'll come back to in a moment, don't pay their fair share. If they did, I believe that we would have $600 or $700 billion more a year in revenue. So you can certainly afford these kind of things. The reason I bring this up is the disparity in taxes is not just a theoretical economic issue. It comes back to true everyday problems and pain for Americans. And when a working family or a middle-class family cannot get their kid into college, this is kind of the reasons.
Right.
If the wealthy paid a little bit more, they'll stay wealthy. It's not going to affect their life in the slightest, but it provides an incredible opportunity to equilibrate things and create much more equal option in our country.
Could we talk a little bit then next about, oh, I should ask you about Common Core. What, have you studied that a little bit? Because
Sure.
they sort of just wiped it out with a stroke of a pen, which I personally am okay with, but what do you think?
As an educator, I believe in standardization. I just don't believe in ridiculousness, and it's always a balance.
Right.
The concept of Common Core, even as a progressive Democrat, I don't mind. I think standardization, you have to have some metric.
Well, I agree
and
with
if
that.
I'm sure you do. And if you don't have a metric, you can't do anything.
Right.
If, on the other hand, you are educating all the time to a test, that's a problem too. And as always, it's always a reasonable balance.
Right, good answer, all right.
There's a couple of pieces in here that we didn't get to talk about as kind of part of your core platform. Universal health care. You're talking single payer, or are you talking some other form of universal health care that you're looking to advocate for on the federal level?
Yeah, single payer. I wouldn't want to invent a new system. We already have Medicare. Medicare works really, really well.
Just expand it for all?
Right. Instead of starting at 65, maybe every year or two you just drop it down until you're down to zero. So for people who don't know the numbers, Medicare spends 1.8% of its money on administrative indirect costs.
Right.
Private industry, in quotes, we in America always say that private industry is efficient. Private industry spends 12.8%. That translates to an extra wasted $400 billion a year. Wasted. The only people who are benefiting from that are health insurance companies and their executives and their stockholders. The country as a whole takes $400 to $500 billion and just throws it in the garbage. So when Trump, for example, wants tariffs on things because he thinks we can't compete, the best thing we could do to make our steel industry, as an example, and this is where it comes back why Medicare for All is so important. If you really want our steel industry to be competitive, first thing you could do is take the anchor of employer-based health insurance off.
Big expense.
It's an incredible expense. So we spend about $10,000 per capita on health insurance. Most modern democracies spend $4,000. Private industry spends more because employer-based health insurance tends to be better than the average. So if you switch to a Medicare for All, and the most modern bill is HR 676 in Congress, the average employee would cost $4,000 less. So if you want our steel to be more efficient, can you imagine if in a stroke of the pen, one bill gets passed and all of a sudden every industry in America is spending $4,000 less on each individual employee?
It'd be huge.
It would be huge. You cut down the prices, you can compete better with other countries. You don't need to go down to tariffs and be protectionists. Now, I'm not saying that tariffs and protectionism isn't sometimes required, but that's sort of the last vestige in terms of understanding international economics. First, fix your own house. The other point is pharmaceutical companies. That's another $150 or so billion that we waste. And if you do a Medicare for All, we'll be able to negotiate for pharmaceuticals. So overall, it's about $600 billion that we would save by switching to Medicare for All, and we'd cover everybody.
We did try it here for a little while.
Well,
Governor
we
Shumlin
didn't have a
tried
big
it.
enough pool to
Yeah,
really
it was
make
too
it
small.
work. But
That was part of the reason.
It's interesting because you point to Medicaid as or
Medicare.
Medicare as a system to replicate. There's a couple other examples of single-payer healthcare systems in the U.S. One of which being military healthcare is essentially a single-payer system.
Right, but can I edit the wording a tiny bit? So
Sure, yes.
The military system, TRICARE, the VA, those are actually further. Those are much more akin to UK's socialist medicine program because the healthcare personnel are all employees of the government.
Right.
When we talk about single payer, it has nothing to do with changing our capitalistic system. The doctors, the physical therapists, the nurses, hospitals, they're all still private if they want to be. Some are public because they already are, but in general they're private. So it's much more akin to the Canadian system or the French system.
So the doctors' salaries would not be set? They would make whatever they can make? under that
Well, they can
scenario?
charge whatever they want as if private insurance. Secondly, but the point is that they don't report to the government. So
right.
I'm a Navy doctor. My boss is the president eventually, I guess in theory, right? Because I'm a federal government employee. But if I was a private doctor, maybe my remuneration every month comes in from Medicare if we had a single payer for all, but I don't report to Medicare.
yeah, right,
I can do kind of what I want
Right.
as an independent private physician.
Cool.
It's a really important point
Yeah.
for those who are
Yeah, no,
who,
that's-
No,
it's
that's good. Yeah,
who
try
want
to
the
care.
market
We
system.
what do we have,
Yeah.
650,000 people here? It was tough to do single payer, because when you get down to the numbers, we'd all be a little hurting from paying into the system. But people supported the system, we just didn't have enough base. But you're saying maybe not.
So this is the way my understanding of the numbers. My understanding is if we did Medicare for all nationally, we'd
Right.
save about 4,000 per person.
Yeah.
Statewide, the numbers were much closer because let's face it, even if we have a single payer Vermont system, that, like you were alluding to, we still have a multi-payer system because you have to interact with all the other
Sure, with
insurance
the other
companies
states,
in the
yeah.
other states.
Right.
But the numbers were still beneficial, by the way. There were still about savings. I know you always have to be suspicious when they're that
Right,
close,
yeah.
but there was about $400. All the estimates from the economists were $400 per capita that
It was
you
the
would save.
upfront
Really?
expenditure that was difficult to get over.
Sure, but the overall expense was for 400. Look, Governor Schulman, in my mind, was not willing. This is only my interpretation.
No.
It might be incorrect, but that there is a political risk when you switch to Medicare for all or Green Mountain Care,
Right,
which is what
right,
it was
right.
in 14 here,
Right.
is there is no question that taxes will go up. The payroll taxes were going to go up because you have to pay for it from somewhere.
Yeah.
But the nuance is that your premiums go away.
So somewhere it balances.
The balance is on balance. Federally, you save thousands. On balance,
Yeah.
in Vermont alone, probably hundreds. And there were other waivers. This was the other issue, as you probably remember, ERISA
Yeah, right.
and other
right.
waivers.
Oh,
that
yeah,
were,
that was the
it was
ERISA
very
stuff.
difficult
That
to get
was-
those
that
kind of
was
waivers.
hard. Yeah. That's right.
So, political fairness, which is an interesting one to highlight. What does political fairness mean, unless it's just a reference back to
Finance.
campaign finance, and or is there more to it than that?
Do you mind if I ask Julius?
Sure.
And then I'll
Yeah.
interject or add something.
Political fairness. I want to be represented by a man of the people for the people. Just going back, I don't want special interests to skew his mindset or
Right.
his platform.
You want them to actually represent the people?
Yes, exactly.
Sounds so old-fashioned,
Whoa.
doesn't it?
So I guess my interpretation of this would be that you want people to operate fairly, both in a campaign setting where you're raising money and you're abiding by best practice in terms of you're not taking special interest money, but also once you're elected, right?
Yeah.
And you're being honorable in the way that you're communicating to your constituents, you're telling them the truth, and you're upfront and honest about here are the issues.
You live
here's
up to the
debate.
oath you've just taken.
Exactly, and I guess that's where what my interpretation of it would be.
Sure, I think all of the above. I would summarize it very simply. I guess nowadays they said one man, one vote. So I'd say one person, one vote. And if you're committed to that democratic principle, then you abide by it, like you said, in the way you campaign and in the way you legislate. For example, if you cared about healthcare, because we just talked about it, you would not take money from pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, doctors groups, other hospital industry groups, because you know that if you do, those voters who are participating in those special interests are getting much more access and are tilting the policy in comparison to the average American who doesn't have the opportunity
Right.
or doesn't have the access, whatever it is. So we can talk about that every topic. My critique of Mr. Welsh is that he's no different than all the other congressmen, and I always say that he's in fact probably better, but the bar is kind of low because there's so much money being
Right,
taken.
right.
So maybe there's a moral equivalence that's slightly different, but very, very minimally. I think a public servant should be committed in America to one person, one vote. And I don't think that's asking too much.
Yeah, that's interesting. I realize.
Very interesting.
I just have to ask you my passion these days, because I told you we were doing shows here on the opioid crisis. What would you like to see on this is nationally, so we're having trouble here in Vermont, but it's everywhere.
So you probably don't know, I was brought back into the Navy, by the way. It's called a request by name. to run the Navy Comprehensive Pain Management Program. This was a more than $100 million program that Congress required all of the services to change their treatment of pain to address the opioid epidemic. So I did this for about 2 years full time. I think addressing the opioid epidemic, it's all hands on deck. So there's no right answer. Anybody who says they have the right answer, they're wrong.
Right.
It's all hands. So as an example, you need a cultural change. Both doctors need to stop prescribing opioids inappropriately, which we know ends up causing about 50% of opioid addictions in America in the first place.
Which is a staggering comment in itself.
It's kind of incredible, actually. The history is complicated. Physicians were critiqued about 15 years ago about not treating pain adequately, so they went to the other extreme, and now, of course, they're treating pain too loosely. But I think we as Americans need to also take responsibility, and we need to understand that you can't cure everything. And for example, chronic pain, sometimes the goal has to be to manage it and have it be reasonable that you can live with without having it dramatically affect your life. But complete relief, for example, is not always a realistic goal without leading to addiction. So the medical community has to take responsibility, but so do we Americans more generally.
We just did a show on pain management, on non-pharmaceutical alternatives, wellness, you know, just massages and acupuncture, anything that will help the whole body. I guess that's the focus these days, is the whole body, not just the addiction. And I think that's a great change mentally.
Absolutely.
It's going to be hard to change the culture, but I don't know what else options we have. It's huge, this problem.
You're totally right, and that was all our effort. We call it non-opioid treatments or non-pharmacologic treatments. Sometimes you use various medications that are not opioids. Sometimes you use things that aren't even medications at all, non-pharmacologic, like you said, acupuncture, yoga, massage. TENS, there's all different things that one can do to avoid opioids.
So how would the national government, if you're there, what could they do? And just, is it funding, or is it just a change of a whole nation's culture?
This part is culture, and therefore it's back to leadership and role modeling. But we didn't discuss other things. Funding is really, really important. So I work, half of my time is more or less ER time. And every ER shift I have at least a few people who want assistance with rehab for either alcohol, polysubstance abuse, or opioid in particular. And I can usually get them in eventually. Keyword is eventually.
Exactly. We have waiting lists everywhere.
And the reason that you have waiting lists, it's back to taxes again. Anybody can say, I want increased resources and fund things. People say, for example, I care about the veterans, but if you really care about the veterans, money talks. Put more money into the veteran hospitals, for example, and into retraining for veterans. And the same thing with opioids is, there are long, long waiting lists because there's not enough money being resourced in that direction.
Beds. It's really, we did a thing on co-occurring illnesses too. So if mental illness, which is a big problem in this state, we've done a bunch of shows on it. It's really scary.
We don't have enough beds or providers.
With the opioid addiction on top of it, I mean, these people just live in I don't know how they face the day because they've got so many things going on. It's pretty scary. It's scary.
So
anyway.
the last, we only have a few minutes left, but the last key piece of your platform was the green revolution and jobs, which I think is referring to, creating a more sustainable, energy production system in the U.S. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and what you envision in the next 10 or 20 years in terms of energy production in the U.S.?
So what I envision for all these things is kind of the same thing I envision for all the other topics. If you are wealthy and doing well, or if you are whatever establishment means, incrementalism is an acceptable way because you're doing all right. If you're in distress, or if the planet is in distress, to come back to your question, one doesn't have time for incrementalism. That's where you need dramatic changes in taxes for economic reasons. For the environment, we just don't have room for minor things on the fringe. So we need massive investment, in my mind, in renewables and mass transit to be 100% carbon free in some target, whatever is reasonable, and one can always negotiate that. How you get that? Almost always incentives and penalties. A fair progressive carbon tax, I think, is the right thing to do because it will incentivize the right industries. Could you imagine if Vermont, by the way, just to talk, we really haven't gotten much of a chance because we've been so busy with so many topics, talking about Vermont in a sense. And I think this, how do we make Vermont into a vibrant economy? In my opinion, what you need to do is you need to go back and say, what are our strengths? Because we can't compete on the big, large scale when we only have 625, 630,000 people. So what are our strengths? One of our strengths is education that we always lament, actually. Yes, our property taxes are high, but for a rural community, we have a pretty good education. We should be advertising that. Imagine come back for green energy, if we in statute rather than goals, because we do have carbon-free goals right now, but we don't have statute where we have to be by law carbon-free by blank, blank year. Actually, we should just take California and beat them by a year. So imagine we advertise that we are the #1 country. We are going to be the first state in America to be carbon-free, and we are going to do everything politically and by law and our economy to achieve that. Imagine if we decided Vermont politicians don't take special interest money. I mean, every other state can do it. We don't. We get the Medicare for all, or if it's Green Mountain Care, we achieve all this, and we advertise this. Can you imagine how many people, in terms of the growth, would be moving in? Smart, thinking people. We'd be an incredibly attractive state, and I think it would really help the vibrancy of our economy.
I think we've talked over now. Julius moved from California to come here to UVM. Sit and interview Julius and ask him what attracted you here. Our environment. What made you come to Vermont from California?
Yeah, to be honest, it was the progressive nature of the state.
Right.
I'm an environmentalist. I love being outdoors, but coming to a state like this, seeing that we're advocating for renewable energy,
right,
seeing that we're taking our social programs seriously, these were just a few of the reasons that attracted me to the state.
So then we're always looking for people, and I'm thinking, why don't you find out what you're taking and try to build jobs in that sector, and then you would stay here and maybe go home someday with your family, but stay here and start your career.
And that was exactly it. When I said if we made a carbon-free goal, the economic consequences of that is that we would have to have huge expenditures in solar and wind and whatnot, which would, of course, create lots of good jobs and all the spin-off for businesses. It seems like it's a win-win for everybody, other than for the carbon fuel companies, fossil fuel companies.
Exactly. We have 3 minutes, and I certainly want to introduce the group that's here with you, but could you take 2 of those minutes and just sort of summarize your platform and that stump speech that you would give when you're at the Tunbridge World Fair or something like that?
We'll be there.
Good.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing that I'm trying to accomplish with this campaign is to get Vermonters, or to urge Vermonters respectfully to step up yourself and demand more, and not accept mediocrity, not accept that this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, this is what you have to do, this is what's practical. We can expect so much more, and we can make it happen in Vermont. We should be the first when it comes to everything that's really important in our civic, in our social, in our healthcare, our economic, and our environmental realm. And that's really the essence of my campaign.
I think people don't realize their vote counts. And they always say, oh, well, what's the point? It's not going to matter. But it really does matter here. We've passed some very serious legislation here by 1 vote over the years. So that's in the legislature, but at home it's what
Your
it's
vote counts, and actually the primary really, really matters.
Yes, exactly.
Because people always show up, so many more to the general election, but it's already preordained once the general election occurs.
Right, exactly.
The primary is where you have an option to actually explore ideas
that's good.
that
We
are
should
new.
push that. Could you all come join us and stand behind
join
Dan,
everybody.
and Dan can introduce you to everybody. So when you're out on the campaign trail, they'll know who's who.
Brought the whole crew today.
Now, everybody, no, there's 12 altogether, so there's some missing. So, why don't you start?
I'm Julie Belanger from Rochester, New York.
I'm Jake Axby from Massachusetts.
I'm Helen Drazen from Pelham, New York. I'm Brianne Smith from Oneonta, New York.
Got your hands full there, young man.
I sure do.
Well, congratulations to you all, and I hope you love our state and Get out there and shake hands. Great, thank you very much for coming. It
Pat,
was a
thank you
pleasure.
so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Ben, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
Thank you,
Ben.
tuning
Thanks for
in. Remember, we'll see you next week, and remember in the meantime to keep listening beyond the sound bites. And if you're a candidate and want to come on the show, vote for Vermont at gmail.com. Thank you.